Today I'm talking about data-driven decision-making and how to cultivate that at a growing airline. So before I start, since there isn't time for questions, I have my, I have my Twitter handle up there. I'm not a huge Twitter user. I revived it for this conference, but if you want, you can contact me there or on Slack. How do I go to the next? All right. So for those of you who don't know, or one of the reasons why JetBlue is Jared's favorite airline, Jared loves anything New York, and we're New York's hometown airline. So we're the only airline to be headquartered in New York since Pan Am, fun fact. So quick show of hands, how many people in this room have flown on JetBlue? Yeah, so a lot of you. So New York is one of our focus cities, and we have a pretty big presence in JFK. We have our market share is substantial. So many people on the East Coast don't realize that we've actually only been around since the millennium. But since then, we've expanded across the US, Caribbean, and Latin America. Cuba was our 100th city, or Havana was our 100th city. And we actually, since then, started flying to Atlanta, so we're at 101. So just 2 years after our inaugural flight, the former CEO of the former Continental Airlines was quoted saying this: I don't think JetBlue has a better chance of being profitable than 100 other predecessors with new airplanes, new employees, low fares, all touchy-feely, all of them are losers, most of these guys are smoking ragweed. So it's a funny quote, but I think it's also indicative of how we've been able to innovate within the industry and sort of defied the odds. So how have we fared as a young airline? There's been a fair amount of consolidation in the airline industry. Continental was acquired by United in 2012. And even this chart is a little dated because Virgin America merged with Alaska just last year. So we're now the only remaining airline to survive the recession without filing for bankruptcy or facing consolidation. And we're doing really well. We're the 5th largest US domestic carrier, and it's a pretty major feat. We've defied the odds, exceeded expectations, and we're seeing and continue to see a rapid amount of growth. So now what? Did I end it? Was that me? I said, now what? Was that like a Amazon Echo type thing, or it just like poof? Is it?
Yeah, it's still up.
It's gone on my thing. Oh, I don't see my notes. Okay, well, I can talk about this slide. So I have a comic up here. All right. Quit on.
Oh wait, no, you're out of sync with what's on there though. We're seeing airline data, stream data.
Oh no. Okay, go back to the one with the rock and the wheel.
There you go.
Is it? Is it synced? Okay. So technical difficulties had to happen. So we're straddling the line between startup and corporate culture. We deal with a lot of legacy software and business and rigid business processes, but we have the limited resources and growing pains of a startup. So compared to other airlines, our budget is smaller, our operations is smaller, and many of the processes we built just a few years ago weren't built to scale. So I think whether you're at a startup or an older industry, a lot of these challenges might sound familiar to you, especially if you're working in the realm of data science. So some of the key data challenges we deal with is legacy software and lack of data integration. And we don't have a core data team, which can be a pro and a con. I know this tends to be like a debate at this conference, but it means data is sort of scattered between work groups, and you're sort of like, things get lost in translation. Variables or metrics might be referred to something by one group and something else by another. And a lot of our data exists in data silos and is sometimes out of reach. And we also deal with a lot of data architecture, And scale is a big one. So a lot of reports, models, and processes were built in Excel and SAS, which doesn't provide the ability to scale as we continue to grow. So you guys already saw this, but airline data is stream data. If you saw my speaker photo, it's a picture of me flying a plane. So I like to trick people into thinking I'm a pilot. It's a long tradition. But yeah, so on a structural level, most of our data is reported publicly. So it's fairly transparent as an industry. It's standardized. I tend to work with fairly well-structured data, so still have to spend a lot of my time on data processing, but not as much as other industries. And there's a lot of data. We're swimming in it. And for a transportation nerd, it's sort of a dream to be analyzing movement patterns and making decisions on where and how people fly, like to Cuba. So I work specifically in airline pricing, and the number one question that I get is, when is the best time to buy a plane ticket? And I got this question a lot last year at the conference too, where it was like, it's not that simple. Like, you work in data. But I pulled up this itinerary yesterday for New York to San Francisco, which I think is probably a common route for a lot of people in this room. And you can see that Google Flights added this new feature that says there's like 10% fare increase likely to occur in 8 hours. And they added some explanation since then. But before, I think even a few weeks ago, they didn't have that. So there's no data sorcery behind that. The 10% fare increase is because that particular fare is set to expire due to the fare restrictions. So if you dig into, this is all public on ITA Matrix, which is an excellent tool for airline nerds. If you dig into the fare rules, you can see that it's just coded into the restrictions. So it's not like they're predicting it will go up by 10%. They sort of know it. But it's kind of cool that it's all public now also. ITA Matrix, great tool. So brief history of airline revenue management. So I have here on the left sort of classic airline pricing before the 1980s, where there was a singular price point, no differentiation. And then around the 80s, airlines created this field called revenue management, where you can offer multiple price points and differentiate between customers. So this allowed for airlines to segment demand a lot easier. And I also have, I guess, sort of aligned with the blue theme. If you remember school pictures, the lasers from the 80s. I don't know. Apparently not. So since then, since the 80s, the concepts have kind of remained the same. So when you talk about dynamic pricing in the airline industry, it's not quite in the sense that we think about dynamic pricing today. So computational power, I'm sure you all know, is very limited in the 80s. So it created this structure of there being a pricing group and an inventory group, and they work in conjunction to determine the price point and the fare structure, and then inventory allocates the availability within each fare class. So the life cycle of a fare looks a little bit like this, where the pricing team sends fare changes up to a clearinghouse to something called the government filing system, and that clearinghouse is called ATPCO, which then goes to a global distribution system, GDSs, which was created during the era of paper ticketing and travel agencies, if you remember that. I don't. So, and then the GDSs then distributes the fares to the airlines, and it hosts all the fare and inventory data and the reservations. So that goes to JetBlue.com and then reaches the customer. And all throughout this, the pricing team monitors the fare changes once it hits the GDSs, and we sort of analyze what's going on and execute our response. So what patterns do airlines look for in the data? One common practice in the airline industry is system-wide fare increases, and these are reported publicly and monitored by airlines and Wall Street investors. But it can be kind of difficult to define what an increase is. So I have this graph, and I'll explain why it's not pretty. So it's so I made a conscious decision to use sort of like base R to do this, not ggplot or anything, and I'll explain why. But so plotting out the fare change data might look something like this. If you plot out a submission or new load of data. So there's a wide spread of fare amounts, and there's a lot of noise in there. So it's hard to identify the increase. And then when you remove the outliers, you can kind of see the common fare change amounts for 0, 3, and 6. So it all checks out. The fare increase was $3. The $6 is for round trip fares. And as I mentioned, of course, there's a wide range of methods to approach this. With like machine learning, you could do clustering, decision trees. But part of this talk is an opportunity to discuss how to convince your colleagues to leave spreadsheets behind and streamline existing processes by using R. And I think outliers and basic statistics tends to lower the barrier of entry to R for like small to medium-sized data analysis, especially for people who don't come from that background. So another XKCD comic, I'm sure there will be a few, on spreadsheet analysis. So it's algorithms by complexity, and all the way to, at the highest level of complexity, is a sprawling Excel spreadsheet built up over 20 years by a church group in Nebraska to coordinate their scheduling. So I'm sure we've all been through this, because I think no matter how sophisticated your organization is, there's still some old report or process lying around somewhere that lives on an Excel spreadsheet. And it can be frustrating, but it's also an opportunity to convince your colleagues that programming isn't really that scary. It's not as scary as these spreadsheets. And it's more intimidating, actually, to inherit one of these spreadsheets when someone leaves, which happens a lot. So it's sort of like showing them how to do the extensive like sorting, filtering, and clicking that you do in Excel, streamlining that in R. And I think it's really gratifying when I work with someone at work and they get hooked and start asking questions about R, like, can I do this and can I do that? It's gratifying for me, and I think it's also gratifying for people who've never programmed before. So this is sort of like a common problem that we work with, right? So I want to use this opportunity to also talk about the importance of domain expertise. So working with people in the decision-making side of stuff gives us more insight to the data and knowing how to approach it properly. So if you look at this, it's an example of how we're segmenting demand on a single flight or on a single route on a single day. So airlines have thousands and thousands of flights, and each flight is on a different day, different hour, it's a different market, different aircraft, and each seat is a different product, really. And all of those goods are perishable. So once the flight leaves, it's gone. So when I'm like, if you come from outside of the industry and you approach this problem, when you're aggregating market performance or creating forecasts, outliers and extreme values can be these like pesky things that are skewing your data. So a single, like red-eye flight that was added last minute might skew your market performance, but those can actually end up being exactly what people on the business side are interested in, because it's sort of the key areas of opportunity. And I think it's something that we need to address as a data community. Just not all NAs are created equally, and differentiating between missing and extreme values. So on thinking holistically about your data, so noticing quirks in the data we might not otherwise is something that like comes out of working with people on the business side of things. And as I mentioned, like when we think about outliers, usually it's just like, okay, like this is like a missing value, like automatic NA. We were talking about this at the speaker dinner yesterday. But for businesses, the extreme values can often provide the most valuable insight. So if you think about like server data, right? Like an extreme value might actually be a faulty server. And for airline pricing, extreme values can be areas of opportunity for offering sales or discounts. Okay. So I wanted to arrive at creating sort of a data-driven decision-making data pipeline. That's a lot of Ds. And I think usually when we've talked about data pipelines in the past, we end at the report or analysis phase. But I think we really need to start focusing on the implementation phase, because I'm sure a lot of people in this room have had this happen where they hand off the analysis and then it goes into deployment and suddenly you're like, wait, that's not what I meant. Or like, this doesn't look like what I was saying. So I think there are two things. It's a way for us to, whether it's like a heuristic or a model or like a pricing strategy, it's a way for us to make sure that whatever analysis we created is still in line with like what we arrived at. And I think this is especially critical if you're trying to figure out how to translate an academic background to industry. So just some tips on getting started. If you're starting to introduce people at work to R, here are some like takeaways I've had so far. I think automation tends to be like my go-to, because that's the easiest that can be quantified for one. And it's also saving people time is always an easy sell, especially at a resource-strapped organization. So I keep a list of like actions that I find myself or I see other people repeating, and I have Post-its everywhere on this. And when I have time, I find ways to automate it. So it ranges from like monthly reports to like template write-ups to data processing. And I try to do this in parallel with like the old method in Excel or SAS to like build knowledge and also demonstrate the value of R. So R for everyone. Actually, Jared, is this the name of your book? It wasn't intentional. Yeah. So R for everyone. R for everyone. So I don't know about you, but whenever I'm tasked with teaching R, I get really overwhelmed because base R is really hard to teach. And especially when you're given like a 1-hour session on a Friday that people are volunteering to go to. But I think what I've realized is not everyone needs to gain fluency to start using R. And if you use an applied approach, people get hooked really easily and it lowers the barrier of entry to R programming. So what I do is I prepare scripts for common tasks and I write like a ton of comments and run through common workflows. So dplyr, tidyr tends to be like a good way to start. And then talking about different data types, vectors, data frames, lists, and using R notebooks for training and prototyping. Which is kind of crazy because I think R Notebooks was debuted last year at last year's conference. And I think we were talking about spreadsheets before. So as much as I complain about spreadsheet analysis, I actually think Excel and SQL can provide a really good frame of reference for people with limited programming experience. So to be able to say, okay, a VLOOKUP is like a join, and they're familiar with all the sorting and filtering and aggregating, and showing them how to do that in R is really helpful. And all throughout this, I also talk about the benefits of programming over spreadsheet analysis. So instead of waiting for an Excel file to load, to like look at column names, you can just use like the name syntax or something. So small things like that can encourage people and warm them up to the idea of using R. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen this Venn diagram before. It's like Drew Conway's Venn diagram. So once people reach a certain level of fluency, just an important reminder that not everyone should or needs to be fitting models. That's sort of the danger zone. But at the same time, I think R still makes the world go round, and there's still a variety of ways users in the decision-making process can use R. And R isn't just for data scientists and statisticians, and I think we're like pretty good about being open as a community, but I think like as more people continue to use R, we don't sort of like build this ivory tower. And I think cultivating literacy across an organization is actually really important for scalable analysis, especially when you consider where your data sources will eventually be coming from. And saving time and introducing them to this concept of reproducibility can be a benefit for a lot of people. So yeah, I guess like once you get beyond data wrangling, some of the things I've started to work on with people at work is teaching them how to look at summary statistics and data visualization, how to automate reports, and then eventually being able to level up to interactive data visualization, dashboarding, heuristics and decision trees. So some models are okay. And I think it also helps us because I talked about the outliers and how we tend to think about things, extreme values that way. I think working with decision makers has allowed me to ask and answer the right questions about my data. So that's all I have. I have my contact info up here again if you have questions, but also we are also hiring data people throughout the organization, so if you want to talk to me, feel free to reach out. But enjoy the conference.